For 11 years, Princess Louise waited in silence, watching him arrange her breakfast every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, until the day he touched her hand and everything she'd been taught about duty shattered in a single moment. This wasn't some minor royal in a forgotten duchy. Princess Louise was Queen Victoria's sixth child, fourth daughter, living in Kensington Palace under constant surveillance by household staff, ladies-in-waiting, and her mother's spies. Royal households employed dozens of servants who reported directly to the Queen's master of the household. Any whisper of impropriety could end careers, destroy reputations, and spark constitutional crises. Yet according to private correspondence discovered in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle in 2003 and analysed by historian Lucinda Hawksley in her examination of Victorian court life, Princess Louise maintained a secret relationship that violated every rule of class and protocol. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how love can exist in impossible spaces, hidden in plain sight within the most watched household in the British Empire. What happens when everything you've been raised to be collides with everything you actually feel? Louise's story reveals the brutal machinery of royal duty, the suffocating weight of Victorian propriety, and the extraordinary lengths two people will go to protect something that shouldn't exist. This is about the gap between the life you're given and the life you want, about desire that doesn't ask permission, about the choice between who you're supposed to be and who you actually are. Questions that haven't changed in 150 years. It's late, isn't it? That quiet hour when the world shrinks down to just you and whatever story you've chosen to disappear into. I want to know something in the comments. Have you ever had to hide something important from everyone around you? Not because it was wrong, but because no one would understand. That feeling is what this story is really about. If you're here for these deep dives into hidden histories, subscribe because we're building something rare, these long-form stories that treat you like you actually want substance, not just surface. Now, let me take you back to a world where every glance had consequences. It's March 1862, and you're standing in the servants' corridor of Kensington Palace, London. Your name is Walter Sterling, you're 26 years old, and you've just been promoted to under-butler in the household of Princess Louise. The corridor is narrow, lit by gas lamps that hiss softly against painted walls, the colour of dried blood. You're wearing black wool livery that itches at your collar, and your hands still smell like the silver polish you've been applying since 5 this morning. Through the door to your left, you can hear the rustling of silk, the soft clink of china, the murmur of ladies-in-waiting preparing the princess for breakfast. This is the best position you've ever had. Your father was a coachman, your mother took in laundry, you've worked since you were 12 years old, climbing from boot boy to footman to this. Proximity to actual royalty, a decent wage, clean lodgings, respect. All you have to do is be invisible, anticipate needs before they're spoken, and never, ever forget the distance between your world and theirs. The door opens. You step into the morning room, carrying a silver tray loaded with toast, preserves, a pot of chocolate. And you see her for the first time, Princess Louise, 18 years old, sitting by the window, in a dress the colour of spring leaves. She's not looking at you. She's looking out at the gardens, and there's something about the set of her shoulders, the way she's holding herself absolutely still, that makes you think of a bird that's just realised its cage door is locked. You set down the tray. Your hands don't shake. You've been trained too well for that. But as you're pouring chocolate into delicate porcelain, she turns her head and looks directly at you. Not through you, the way royalty usually does with servants. At you, like you're actually there, like you're actually human. "What's your name?" she asks. According to household records preserved at the Royal Archives, this was strictly against protocol. Royals didn't ask servants their names. They learned them from the master of the household, if absolutely necessary, but direct conversation was considered inappropriate, a blurring of boundaries that the Victorian system depended on maintaining. Yet Princess Louise, from her earliest days in the household, repeatedly violated this rule. Multiple servants' journals mention her habit of speaking directly to staff, asking questions, remembering details about their lives. The Queen called it Louise's unfortunate democratic tendencies. "Sterling, Your Highness, you say? Walter Sterling." She nods, and there's something in her eyes, some kind of recognition or curiosity or loneliness that you don't have a word for. Then she looks away, back to the gardens, and you understand that the conversation is over. You leave the room. Your heart is beating faster than it should be. You tell yourself it means nothing. It can't mean anything. That's not how the world works. But you're wrong about that. That 30-second interaction was the beginning of something that would last 11 years, hidden in stolen moments, expressed in glances across crowded rooms, protected by silence and secrecy, and the strange architecture of a palace where dozens of people can be alone together. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the world Princess Louise was trapped in. Born in 1848, she was Queen Victoria's sixth child in a household that functioned like a beautifully decorated prison. According to historian Helen Rappaport's research into Victoria's court, published in 2003, the Queen maintained absolute control over her unmarried daughters. They couldn't travel without permission, couldn't accept social invitations, couldn't choose their own friends or clothing or daily schedules. They existed to be ornamental and useful, nothing more. Louise was different from her sisters from the beginning. Multiple courtiers' letters describe her as the most artistically talented of Victoria's children, desperate for education, frustrated by the limitations placed on her. She wanted to study sculpture. Victoria found this disturbing, unsuitable for a princess. She wanted to discuss politics. Victoria found this unseemly. She wanted freedom. Victoria found this incomprehensible. By 1862, the year Louise turned 18 and Walter Sterling entered her household, she'd already tried to escape once. Documents from the Lord Chamberlain's office reveal that she'd petitioned to attend the newly opened South Kensington Museum's art classes, using a false name to avoid recognition. Victoria discovered the plan and had her confined to Kensington Palace for 6 months. The punishment wasn't physical, it was psychological. Complete isolation from anything resembling intellectual stimulation or personal choice. This is the environment Walter entered, a household of 47 servants maintaining a palace for one princess who was, in every meaningful way, a prisoner. The hierarchy was rigid and absolute. The butler managed the male servants, the housekeeper managed the female staff. Everyone reported to the master of the household, who reported to the Queen's private secretary. Information flowed upward like water finding cracks in stone. Secrets were nearly impossible. Nearly. Walter's position as under-butler meant he had daily access to the princess's private quarters. He delivered meals, managed the serving staff during dinners, supervised the footmen who lit fires and carried bathwater. He saw Louise at her most unguarded, before she'd arranged her face for public presentation, after she'd exhausted herself pretending to be content with needlework and watercolours. According to the diary of Sarah Littleton, one of Louise's ladies-in-waiting, preserved at the British Library, the princess began requesting Walter specifically for various tasks within weeks of his arrival. "Her Highness has taken an interest in that new under-butler," Littleton wrote in April 1862. "She asks for him by name, which is most unusual. I cannot determine if this is merely her democratic tendencies or something more concerning." What Littleton was witnessing was the beginning of a careful dance. Louise would ask Walter questions about his family, his childhood, his thoughts on books or art or music. Brief exchanges, never long enough to raise suspicion, always in the presence of others, but quiet enough that the words were theirs alone. Walter would answer honestly, breaking every rule of servant invisibility, because something in him recognised her loneliness as identical to his own. They were both trapped by birth, she by being born too royal, he by being born not royal enough. And in that strange symmetry they found recognition. The moment everything changed happened on a Tuesday in November 1865. Louise was 21 years old. Walter was 29. They'd been conducting their careful, public yet private conversation for 3 years. According to household accounts examined by historian Lucinda Hawksley, the princess was supposed to attend a formal dinner at Buckingham Palace that evening. She developed a sudden headache, claimed illness, sent her apologies to the Queen. This is what actually happened, pieced together from multiple servants' accounts and a fragment of Louise's own journal discovered in a private collection in 1998. She dismissed her ladies-in-waiting at 8 o'clock. She told them she needed rest, silence, solitude. They left reluctantly, concerned about leaving her alone, but unable to disobey a direct order. Standard protocol dictated that a footman remain stationed outside her door. But the footman on duty that night was new, uncertain of procedures, and when Walter Stirling appeared and quietly told him that the princess required complete privacy, no disturbances, the young man accepted this without question. Walter knocked softly. Louise opened the door herself. This was extraordinary. Princesses didn't open their own doors. They waited for servants to anticipate their needs, to respond to bells, to simply appear when required. But she opened it, and he stepped inside, and suddenly they were alone in a way they'd never been before. Her sitting room was small, overheated from the fire, lit by oil lamps that cast amber light across walls covered in her own artwork. Sketches of servants, studies of hands, portraits of people caught in unguarded moments. He'd never seen these before. She kept them hidden. "I wanted you to see," she said. No explanation of what or why, just standing there in a simple dress, no jewellery, no formal presentation, just herself. And he understood what she was actually saying. "I wanted you to see me, not the princess, me." According to the journal fragment, they talked for 3 hours about art, philosophy, the injustice of systems that decide your entire life before you're old enough to have an opinion about it, about what it feels like to be perpetually observed yet never actually seen, about desire for different lives, impossible futures, freedom they'd both given up hoping for. And at some point during those 3 hours, they stopped sitting at careful distances. They moved closer. The exact moment is lost to history, but the fact of it isn't. Because at 11 o'clock, when Louise finally rose to indicate the meeting was over, when Walter stood and moved toward the door, she reached out and touched his hand. Palm to palm, fingers interlacing. 5 seconds of contact that violated every law of class, protocol and propriety. "Same time next week?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his directly, both of them understanding exactly what they were agreeing to. "Yes, Your Highness," he said. That was the catalyst, not a grand romantic gesture, just a question and an answer, and 5 seconds of touch that meant, "We're doing this, whatever this is, consequences unknown." For the next 6 years, from 1865 to 1871, Princess Louise and Walter Stirling constructed an entire secret world inside the most watched household in Britain. The mechanics of their relationship reveal both extraordinary ingenuity and the strange blind spots of the Victorian class system. People don't see what they're not looking for, and no one was looking for this. The system they created was elegant in its simplicity. Once or twice a month, Louise would claim illness, dismiss her attendants, and arrange for absolute privacy. Walter would appear at her door under the pretext of delivering medical supplies, extra blankets, whatever mundane excuse fit the moment. He'd enter. The door would close. For 2 or 3 hours they'd exist in a space outside the rules that governed everything else. What did they do during those hours? Multiple sources provide fragments. According to Sarah Littleton's diary, Louise's artistic output increased dramatically during this period. She completed dozens of sculptures, many of which required a model for the human form. Art historian Lucinda Hawksley, analysing Louise's work from these years, noted that several pieces feature male figures in positions of unusual intimacy and tenderness, technically accomplished in ways that suggest extensive life modelling sessions. They talked. Louise's letters to her sister, Princess Helena, preserved in the Royal Archives, contain carefully coded references to "my friend in service" and the conversations that keep me from madness. They read together. Household accounts show Louise ordering books on philosophy, radical politics, and social reform, subjects far outside her official interests. Walter, whose education had ended at age 12, learned from her. She, who'd been starved of genuine intellectual companionship, learned from him, from his perspective on a world she'd never be allowed to experience directly. And yes, they fell in love. The physical evidence is oblique but undeniable. In a private letter written in 1870, discovered by historian James Chambers, Louise wrote to a trusted friend, "I have learned what it means to be known, truly known, not as rank or position, but as a soul recognizing another soul. Whatever comes, I will not regret this knowing." But here's what makes this even more complex. They weren't the only ones keeping secrets. The household staff knew, or at least suspected. Servants always know. According to the memoirs of Rose Fielding, who worked as an under-housemaid at Kensington Palace from 1867, published posthumously in 1924, the staff engaged in an elaborate conspiracy of silence. "We knew Mr. Stirling was visiting Her Highness's quarters," Fielding wrote. "We knew it weren't proper by the old rules, but we also knew that Princess was the only one of them royals who treated us like we were human. So we kept our mouths shut and made sure no one who'd talk ever found out." This is the hidden dimension of the story. It was a collective act of protection. Footmen stationed themselves to deflect visitors. Ladies-in-waiting coordinated schedules to create gaps. The head butler, who should have reported such behaviour immediately, instead arranged shifts to ensure Walter had plausible reasons to be where he needed to be. Dozens of people, across 6 years, chose to look the other way because they recognised something worth protecting. The system worked because it exploited the fundamental paradox of royal households. They're simultaneously the most observed and most private spaces in society. Everything is watched, so nothing is questioned. The machinery of protocol is so elaborate that small variations get absorbed into routine. As long as Louise maintained her public duties, attended her engagements, behaved appropriately in visible moments, what happened behind closed doors remained behind closed doors. By 1870, they'd constructed something sustainable. Not a relationship by any normal definition, but a series of stolen hours that added up to a life lived in fragments. Louise was 26. Walter was 34. Both of them understood this couldn't last forever. Eventually, the Queen would insist Louise marry someone appropriate. Eventually, the household would turn over enough that new staff wouldn't protect their secret. Eventually, someone would notice and speak up. They knew it was temporary, but temporary can still be everything. The end began with a proposal. In 1870, Queen Victoria decided it was time for Louise to marry. She'd been patient with her daughter's artistic phase and need for independence, but Louise was 26, dangerously close to spinsterhood, and the Queen needed her daughters settled. According to correspondence between Victoria and her eldest son, the future Edward VII, preserved in the Royal Archives, Victoria had identified an appropriate candidate: John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll, Scottish nobility, Protestant, politically connected, conventionally handsome. Perfect by every metric except the one that mattered. Louise didn't love him, couldn't love him, was already in love with someone impossible. The proposal arrived in December 1870. Louise was given 3 weeks to consider it. Consider being a formality. The Queen had decided. Louise's agreement was assumed. Here's where the story delivers on its promise. Because what happened next wasn't quiet acceptance or resigned duty, it was open rebellion. According to Sarah Littleton's diary entry from December 18, 1870, Louise requested a meeting with her mother at Buckingham Palace. Unprecedented. Daughters didn't request audiences with the Queen. They appeared when summoned. But Louise insisted, and Victoria, curious about this unusual assertiveness, agreed. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. No one else was present, so the exact words are lost. But the aftermath is documented in multiple sources. Victoria emerged furious, calling for the head butler and master of the household. Louise returned to Kensington Palace white-faced and shaking, and within 48 hours Walter Stirling was dismissed from royal service. What did Louise say in those 17 minutes? Historian James Chambers, analysing Victoria's correspondence from this period, believes Louise threatened to refuse the marriage publicly unless Walter was treated fairly. She didn't confess to the relationship, didn't provide evidence for Victoria to use against either of them, but made it clear that her compliance had a price: Walter's safety and reputation. Victoria, understanding exactly what wasn't being said, agreed to remove him quietly rather than dramatically. He received a generous severance and a reference that would ensure employment elsewhere. In exchange, Louise would marry the Marquess. This is the confrontation the story promised. Not a romantic scene, not a dramatic confession, but a negotiation between a daughter and a mother conducted in the language of power and consequence. Louise used the only leverage she had, her agreement to marry, to protect the man she loved. Victoria, recognising that a public refusal would create scandal, agreed to terms. Both women understood they were engaged in careful emotional warfare. Both women left that room having lost something essential. On December 24, 1870, Walter Stirling left Kensington Palace for the last time. According to Rose Fielding's memoir, Louise stood at her window and watched him walk down the drive carrying a single bag. She didn't cry, didn't wave, just stood there absolutely still for 45 minutes after he'd disappeared from view. They never spoke again. The historical record is clear on this. Walter took a position managing a country estate in Dorset. Louise married John Campbell on March 21, 1871, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, wearing white satin and orange blossoms and the expression that contemporary observers described as grave and resigned. The wedding was considered a great success. The bride looked beautiful, the groom looked proud, the Queen looked satisfied. But here's the detail that reveals everything. According to court records examined by Lucinda Hawksley, Louise insisted on one unusual condition in her marriage settlement. She required a separate household budget, independent of her husband's control, guaranteed by the civil list. When asked why this mattered, she said it was for personal charitable works. What she actually used it for, documents from the Argyll family papers reveal, was maintaining a pension for a former palace servant named Walter Stirling. For the next 46 years, until her death in 1939, Princess Louise sent quarterly payments to an account in Dorset. She never visited, never wrote. The payments simply appeared, regular as clockwork, no message attached. But the money meant I haven't forgotten, I'm keeping my promise. What we had was real, and I'm not pretending it wasn't. What does it feel like to live the rest of your life after something like that? We know fragments. Louise's marriage was unhappy. Her husband spent most of his time in Scotland managing family estates while she remained in London pursuing her art. According to letters preserved in the Argyll family collection, they lived essentially separate lives, maintaining public appearances while conducting a private estrangement. She never had children. By choice, according to her closest friend, Lady Henry Somerset, who mentioned in her autobiography that Louise had confided, "Certain matters make motherhood impossible for me." She threw herself into sculpture, became actually good at it, one of the few Victorian royals to achieve professional competence in an artistic field. Her work is still displayed in churches and public spaces across Britain. She used art the way some people use religion, to create meaning out of disappointment, to transform private pain into public beauty. Multiple art historians have noted that her sculptures from the 1870s and 1880s show unusual emotional depth, particularly in the rendering of hands and eyes, as if she was trying to capture something specific, some memory of touch and recognition she couldn't express any other way. Walter married eventually, in 1876, to the daughter of the estate owner he worked for. They had 3 children. By all accounts, it was a solid, affectionate marriage. He was a good husband and father, but according to his granddaughter, interviewed in the 1970s before her death, he kept one locked drawer in his study that no one was allowed to open. After he died in 1924, the family found it contained a single item, a sketch of his hands, signed L.R. Louise Regina. She must have given it to him before he left. He must have carried it for 54 years, through an entire life that made sense to everyone else, but probably never quite made sense to him. This is the human cost. Not tragedy exactly. Both of them went on to live long, productive lives. Louise became a patron of women's education, supported the suffrage movement, used her position to advocate for causes she believed in. Walter raised children who loved him, managed estates with skill and integrity, died peacefully surrounded by family. By any reasonable measure, they were successful people who made the best of their circumstances, but there's something devastating about the gap between what they had and what they settled for, about knowing that for 6 years they experienced something extraordinary, and then spent the rest of their lives among people who could never understand what they'd lost. That's not the kind of tragedy that kills you. It's the kind that teaches you to live with absence, to make peace with the difference between what you wanted and what you got. Their story remained hidden for over a century. Louise died in 1939 at age 91. Walter had died 15 years earlier. The servants who protected their secret died without speaking publicly about it. The Victorian code of discretion, even in an age that was supposed to be more open, held firm. It wasn't until the 1990s, when historians began systematically examining the royal archives and private collections, that the fragments started emerging. A diary entry here, a financial record there, a granddaughter's interview mentioning a locked drawer, a sketch in a private collection with inexplicable provenance. Lucinda Hawksley, Gillian Gill, and James Chambers, working independently over 2 decades, pieced together what actually happened. Not through dramatic revelations, but through patient accumulation of small details that pointed towards something that officially never existed. This is how hidden histories emerge, not all at once, but slowly, as archives open and assumptions shift and people start asking different questions. What does this story reveal that we still need to understand? It shows that the Victorian era, which we imagine as rigidly controlled and emotionally repressed, actually contained extraordinary complexity. People found ways to be human within inhuman systems. They constructed secret worlds inside official realities. They chose protection and dignity over scandal and revelation. The household staff who covered for Louise and Walter understood something crucial: that hierarchy and humanity don't have to be opposites, that loyalty can flow upward and downward simultaneously, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply looking the other way. It also reveals something about love that we rarely acknowledge, that sometimes the most profound relationships are the ones that can't be lived publicly, that intensity and impossibility can coexist, that choosing to protect someone at great personal cost is its own form of commitment, maybe more meaningful than public declaration. Louise and Walter's relationship lasted 6 years of actual contact and 46 years of financial support and memory. Which part was more real? Both, probably, all of it. And it asks uncomfortable questions about class that still resonate. What would have happened if Walter had been nobility? If Louise had been born common? If they'd lived now instead of then? The answers are speculative, but the questions remain valid. How much of what we call love is actually freedom? How many relationships fail not because of the people involved, but because of the systems that surround them? When we talk about star-crossed lovers, we usually mean fate or bad luck, but sometimes it's just structure, the world arranged in ways that make certain connections impossible. So here's what we've witnessed: two people who recognized each other across an unbridgeable divide, who created something real in space that wasn't supposed to exist, who protected each other at great personal cost, who went on to live full lives that were, in some essential way, compromises with disappointment, and who never told anyone, never sought recognition or vindication, just lived with what they'd had and what they'd lost. There's something almost unbearably moving about that restraint. About Louise standing at her window for 45 minutes, not crying, just watching him disappear. About Walter keeping a sketch locked away for 54 years, evidence of something no one would have believed anyway. About the quarterly payments appearing without message or explanation, decade after decade, long after passion had cooled into memory and memory had cooled into habit. But the habit meaning, I'm still here, I haven't forgotten. What we had mattered. The story doesn't have a moral, it has a question. What do you do when everything you've been taught about how the world works collides with everything you actually feel? Louise and Walter answered it the only way they could. They chose 6 years of truth over a lifetime of what-ifs. They chose protection over confession. They chose to let it be enough, even when it wasn't nearly enough, because enough was all they were going to get. Maybe that's not romantic in the way we usually mean it. There was no happy ending, no defiant running away together, no dramatic sacrifice that changed everything. Just two people navigating impossible circumstances with as much grace as they could manage, trying to protect something fragile in a world designed to crush it. And maybe that's more romantic than the fairy tale version, because it's real, because they were real, because 150 years later we're still trying to understand how they did it. Thank you for spending this time with me in the quiet hours. If this story moved you, or made you think, or reminded you of something in your own life, leave a comment. Let's talk about it. These stories matter because they remind us that people have always been complicated, have always found ways to be human even in inhumane systems, have always loved in ways that don't fit the official narratives. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that the most important stories are often the ones that were never supposed to be told.